Hello and welcome back. So, what I want to do is I want to talk about business presentations and I want to highlight some things that are really important when you do presentations. Whether you're doing presentations for a class or you're doing professional presentations for your job of some sort. So, there are several things that I'm going to highlight that I think are really important when it comes to being able to do a really good presentation. The first thing just to kind of touch on is that presentations can be formal or they can be informal. So, a formal presentation obviously would be one where perhaps you don't know a lot of the people in the audience, and the occasion itself might also demand that it is a formal presentation. That might be the expectation because of the actual context of the situation that's going on, of the event that's being held. And so it might just come with that expectation that it's going to be very formal, right? Usually, informal presentations could typically with people that you might know more, that you work with them. They're kind of like your internal audience. So, a lot of times, informal presentations occur with an internal audience. And when I say an internal audience, I'm talking about the people that you see and work with on a constant basis. You know them more. And so you're a little bit more relaxed when you're presenting with that type of audience. Whereas a lot of times the more formal presentation comes with people that you don't know as well. And so there's always trying to, be cautious in being professional in that particular instance. Presentations do become more important as a career progresses, and as a matter of fact, the successes of your career might very well depend on your ability to be able to present in such a way that you're able to get your point across, right? If you think of a job interview, that is a form of a presentation where you're presenting your skills, whatever is on your resume, your skills, your qualifications, your education, your experiences, all that sort of stuff, typically in front of a person or a group of people that you may not know, right? And so it becomes more important as your career progresses. And then you could also say that it also depends, the progress of your career has a lot to do with how you're able to conduct presentations, right? So that could affect the outcome of that. All right, so let's move on. The next thing that I want to touch on is so it's so important to analyze who's in your audience. And a lot of the decisions that go behind the way you decide to present and what you decide to present has a lot to do with who's going to be inside of your audience. So you want to always take your audience into consideration. So who are your key audience members? Your key audience members might be the persons, the people who invited you to the event, the people who invited you to speak. If it's if and not just them, but if they invite you to speak at an organization, then you want to know, is the president of the organization there? Is the CEO there? That sort of stuff, right? Those would be the key people. And so you want to know who they are. And perhaps you also want to address these people at the beginning of your speech, thanking them for inviting you to be able to speak in their presence. All right, so how much does your audience know? Now, if you have an idea of what your audience already knows, obviously it would help you prep for your speech. So I always say in certain situations, especially when it comes to in an academic setting, assume that your audience knows very little. And that way you build your presentation up. And so it becomes a real teaching moment for you as you're able to express your information in such a way that you're educating and you're allowing your audience members to learn. So, but there are instances where your audience members might also know a whole lot about the topic. And so then you do not have to start from the very ground level, right? So always try to get an assessment of how much does the audience know, right? And then you can go from there as you're building your presentation. It helps you determine what are you going to include when you have an idea of what your audience members already know. The other thing, as far as what you include in your speech, is you want to know, well, what does the audience want to know, right? So if you've been invited somewhere to speak and they gave you a very specific topic to speak on, therefore they are expecting you to talk about this. That's what they want the audience to know, right? So sometimes you're given a list of things, some guidelines, not specifically told, but maybe some guidelines, and you work along those guidelines. And those guidelines will then become the expectations of your audience. So what does your audience want to know? That's how you would prepare your presentation. Not just what you want to tell them, but what do they want to know? And then you might be able to include some other things along those lines that you think that are important to share with your audience. What are their personal preferences in terms of how is the information going to be delivered? Is it going to be in a more of a training workshop type of format, smaller room, tables with people around these, people around these tables working on small assignments throughout the course of a day? Or is it a big speech in an auditorium, right? You just got to and a lot of times you would have some leeway with this in terms of how you want to progress conducting your speech. What is the size of the group? Well, if it's a huge group, having workshops, that might be difficult. Type of training sessions, that might be somewhat difficult. If it's a smaller group, a smaller number, 15, 20, 30 people, maybe you can break them up into smaller groups and have some activities that they can do that would assist with learning the material, right? But if it's a huge auditorium and it's probably, 3, 4, 5,000 people, then maybe you're all centered towards giving a speech from a podium or something of this sort, right? So this is some things to consider in terms of audience analysis. You must know who your audience is, right? So that you could know what you're going to be presenting to that audience. A couple of things to take into consideration will be the demographics of the audience. Now, when we're talking about demographics, I'm talking about quantifiable characteristics of a group of people, right? So demographics has to do with quantifiable characteristics of a group of people. In other words, you can count them, right? Quantifiable. You can put them in numbers. So a couple of things to consider would be, what's the gender of the audience? That might influence the way you talk about certain things, the jokes you might make, so you don't offend anyone, right? What's the age of the audience? Same thing. It might have a lot to do, depending on how you, it will have a lot to do with how you would present the information, right? Depending on the age of the audience. Is your audience older? And so maybe you can expect them to be more still, to listen to maybe a longer type of presentation. Or is your audience younger? And so you want to be able to be more interactive with them, to be able to keep the attention of younger people. Those are decisions you'll make depending on the age of the audience. What is the cultural background of the audience, right? And so we're talking racial and ethnic backgrounds here. What is the cultural background? Are they all Americans? Are they foreigners, people from the different nationalities? That has a lot to do also with what you can say, what jokes you might be able to make, the things you've got to be conscious of because of their cultural background. What co-cultures do they belong to as well, right? Those are things that you have to know. What smaller subcultures maybe that some of these people come from. And when you don't know those things, always be careful what you talk about, right? So if you're not invited to talk about religion or politics or sexuality or whatever the case is, maybe those are topics you just don't talk about. And if you do, you thread very lightly how you approach topics like that, because they could turn people off. What is the economic status of the audience? Obviously, economic status is wealth, right? That's a simple way of defining it. So what is the educational, when we talk about economic status, a lot of times we talk about educational background of the audience. We're talking about the income of the audience, right? Their wealth status. That also could have a lot to do with how you approach someone and how you deliver your presentation. Really important to pay attention to that sort of stuff. All right, so as a speaker, you always got to have your goal, right? So what is your goal? I am currently writing a speech, and before I even got to it, the thing is like, what am I trying to accomplish in this presentation, in this speech that I'm going to give? What am I trying to accomplish? So I'm thinking about my goals. And then based on my goals, I could now then start to jot down things I'm going to say. Then how am I going to accomplish that goal? What can I tell stories to help me accomplish that goal? Can I incorporate certain quotes into my presentation that will help me make the point that I'm trying to make? Right? So you always start off with what is the goal, and then you build your presentation off of that to be able to then accomplish that goal. The other thing is, what is your knowledge as a speaker? So you might realize, I love this topic. It's a topic I want to talk about, but you have to do significant research on it. I mean, maybe it's not something you're comfortable with. And even if you know it, the topic, you might still do significant research on it, right? But that's something else that you have to consider. And your feelings about the topic as well. Has a lot to do with the presentation. If you're really passionate about something, a lot of times you're going to be able to speak about it in a much more free fashion, free flowing type of fashion, right? And a lot of times people will gauge your demeanor and your body language as you're speaking, and from that might be able to make an assessment of whether or not you seem like you're interested in the topic that you're delivering. So are you enthusiastic about something? If you get an opportunity to pick something, I would perhaps pick something I'm enthusiastic about because one, I probably already know a lot about it, and then two, it will probably show in terms of my demeanor when I'm actually talking about that specific topic. So something to think about. All right. So the other thing is to you analyze the occasion. What is the occasion? What's the context of the situation that you're walking into? What is the context of the occasion that you're walking into? Is it at a church? Is it at a wedding you're giving this speech? Is it at an organization you're giving this speech? Is it at school? What's the context of the situation, right? And where is it being held? What's the time of the day? What's the hour? How long is your presentation expected to be? Sometimes people will give you a length, and you've got to work within that length of time that you've been given to do the presentation, which means you've got to practice. I always say practice, 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 practice. And the more you're familiar with your speech is the better it's able to just kind of just roll and flow because you know what you're kind of expecting to say. So you don't have to spend your time guessing or reading from a script, right? So, and a lot of times that comes off more naturally. So know the occasion. Are there other people speaking? Are you, therefore you're timed, that sort of stuff, right? What type of event is it? Okay, so typically in academia, depending when you're taking, for example, like a speech class or something, you have an informative and you have a persuasive speech, right? And sometimes, depending on the class, if it's like a public speaking course or something like that, you'll have several more speeches, an entertainment speech and all that sort of stuff. But your typical speeches are for a speech class in college, will be your informative and your persuasive speech. So you have a topic where you inform, and obviously you have a topic where you attempt to persuade your audience. Your grade, as far as I'm concerned, when it comes to your persuasive speech, your grade is not whether or not you actually persuaded anyone. Your grade is the attempt that you make in the act of persuasion, right? So that's kind of how I look at it. All right, so setting up your goal, kind of going back to the goal, like what are the purpose, what's the purpose of your speech? What are you trying to accomplish? So when you're thinking about your goal, you always want to think about what is the purpose of my speech, all right? Who, right? Who are you trying to provide the information to? What type of information are you trying to provide? What do you want the audience to do, to learn? How do you want them to feel? Those are things that must be considered. How, when, where, right? How, when, where? What do I want the audience to do? How do I want them to feel? Who is in my audience? Those are things that you've got to take into consideration when you're shaping the goals of your speech, right? What reaction do you want from your audience? Things to consider as you're putting together a professional presentation. All right, so let's take an example here, kind of an example looking at a couple goals. If you have a goal for a speech and you say, well, I want to collect some sort of money or something like that. So I want to collect some money. And that's the goal of your speech. Well, collect money for who and for what? So I would say that is incomplete. I want to collect some money. But you know who you want to collect the money for, what you want to do with it, but you haven't specifically outlined it. So you've got to be more detailed, right? Is what I'm saying. You want to be more detailed. How much money are you trying to collect? How much money are you trying to collect? And then what are you collecting the money for? Right? So try to be specific as you're coming up with your goals. What is it that I want to do? Who do I want to do this for? That type of stuff. You're getting more specific. And the more specific you get, the easier it is for you to be able to write your presentation. The more specific you are, right, the easier it is to write your presentation because you know what details you're looking for to be able to include in that particular presentation. All right, so typically uh, in a college type format speech, you would have a general purpose if it's an informative speech or specific or a persuasive speech, but you'll still have a general purpose. You'll have a specific purpose, and your general purpose for an informative speech is always just to inform. For a persuasive speech, it's to persuade. And then after that, you'll have your specific purpose, right? So your specific purpose could be to inform my audience about, and then you continue there. And you have, again, be very specific about what you want to inform your audience about. So to inform my audience about, I don't know, Lyme disease. Well, that is not very specific enough. The question would then be, what about Lyme disease would you want to tell your audience about? To inform my audience about the stock market, what about the stock market specifically might you be trying to get your audience to learn, right? So you've got to be very specific when you do that, right? So, and then you'll have, that's basically that. And then you have your thesis. Your thesis is usually one sentence that summarizes or conveys the main message of your speech. One sentence that summarizes or conveys the main message of your speech, right? And then you'll have your introduction, you'll have your body, and you'll have your conclusion of your presentation. All right, so as far as the body is concerned, a lot of times I completely believe in having 2 or 3 main points in your speech, right? So in the body of your speech, I'm a big believer in having 2 or 3 main points, usually 3, right? To be able to really explain and your main idea is to really explain what you're trying to get at. So you divide your speech into 3 main points, or 4 main points, or 5 main points. Again, it depends on the length of your speech, the goal you have, the goal and the direction that you've been given, and then what you're trying to achieve based on that direction. So then you'll have the body of your speech. This is where you have your main points, your main ideas. What is it that you're really trying to get across, right? What points are you trying to get across? That's where those points are included. Those included in the body of your speech. And then the other thing when you have those main points is that you want to then support those main points with research, right? So this is where if you're giving a speech on, let's go back to the stock market. Maybe you might cite something from the Federal Reserve or something like that, right? It helps to support the information that you're trying to convey. Maybe you might cite something from the Treasury Department. Maybe you might cite something from an economist or something like that, someone who's a really renowned economist or something, someone who understands the stock market. And one of the reasons why you cite sources throughout a presentation is it helps to lend credibility to what you're saying. So an audience knows this is not just coming from you, but that you've done your research and that there is information out there, factual information supporting the whatever presentation that you're trying to deliver, supporting the information that you're trying to present to others. You're supporting it with facts. It's not just stuff that you're taking off the top of your head, which means you also got to be very careful where you're pulling your information from if you're going to be trying to present information that has facts. right? Wikipedia is usually not considered a good source. It's not something that I ever recommend, but you could always look at it to give you hints or ideas, but it's not something that I would cite as factual, right? There's a lot of debate sometimes up with Wikipedia. Be careful with blogs and stuff like that, and just random websites. .com usually means business, but it doesn't mean that you can't cite it, because if you were talking about cars or something, or trucks, you might want to cite from Toyota.com because you can pull some information from their website. So it kind of depends on where you're going with your information, what type of information you're trying to present. But always, I am a big believer in always having some kind of support, whether it's a poem or a quote from someone or whatever the case is. Again, depending on the type of presentation, it helps to make your case, right? It helps to support what you're saying, helps to support your main points. All right, so the basic organizational plan for a speech in an academic setting, and it is very similar in a professional setting, but in an academic setting, right, would be to have the introduction. The introduction has your attention getter, right? So the introduction has your attention getter. Don't forget that. That is basically how you're going to start off your speech. How are you going to get the audience's attention? That's the purpose of the attention getter. Is it going to be statistics or something like that that you're going to start off with that would grab the audience's attention? That's something for you to consider. And then you have your thesis, and then you preview your main points. Your body, as I said, usually can have 2, 3, or 4 main points. It depends on how much information and how much time you're trying to get across, right? And then in your conclusion, you always review. You always review your main points. Briefly review your main points, review your thesis, and then you have some kind of closing statement or argument, depending on what type of speech it is that you're going to make, right? So just kind of some things to highlight. All right, so the next thing that I want to look at is I want to talk about Monroe's motivated sequence, right? So that's the next thing I want to talk about is Monroe's motivated sequence, MONROE, apostrophe S, Monroe's motivated sequence. And that has a lot to do basically with 5 things, right? With 5 things that has to do with, and that is, it has attention, need, satisfaction, visualization, and action. So the attention is, if you think of it in terms of a product, how do we let someone know we have a product? First, we have to draw attention to the product. So we might use celebrities or whatever the case is. Let's say it's a celebrity that we use for running shoes, right? And then we have the person wear the shoe in a commercial, the running shoes, and then they tell us how much of a difference that the shoe made for them, right? And that they really need the shoe if they're going to be able to perform in a certain way. And during the commercial, they also tell us how satisfied they are because they're wearing these running shoes, because they're comfortable and they can run faster and further and that type of stuff. And so we're seeing that at home, and somebody that we perhaps admire in some type of way, right, has brought our attention to these running shoes. They are telling us they need it. So now psychologically, now we're thinking maybe we need it too, right? If we go running and stuff like that, they're satisfied. So now we're visualizing ourselves maybe running in these shoes and how satisfied we might feel. And then the last part is hopefully that we will take action, that we will buy the shoe. So that's also an arrangement of how we can put together a speech, right? How could you get the attention of the audience with your speech? How could you tell the audience during that speech that they need to do something, that they will be satisfied by it? And maybe the satisfaction in a situation of the speech is where you can offer some kind of personal anecdote, some story of how something worked for you or how it worked for someone else and they were satisfied. So as someone is sitting in the audience now, they're visualizing themselves as, oh, maybe I will be satisfied with this as well if I was to do this. And then so when I leave the seminar, the presentation, or whatever it is, I take action immediately, right? This could be a motivational speech where I then try to change or turn my life around because of what this speaker said, right? So remember, it's attention, need, satisfaction, visualization, and then bam, you take action. That's Monroe's motivated sequence. All right, so an introduction is really important in a speech. Just kind of keep that in mind. Having an introduction is really important in a speech. And how you start off has everything to do with whether or not people are going to listen to you at all after that first minute that you're up there. Try your best to a lot of times memorize, even if you're reading or whatever the case is, try to memorize much of the first part of your speech, because one thing about presentations is you want to try to make as much eye contact as possible with your audience. Remember, eye contact means respect. A lot of times people think you know what you're saying because you're looking at them, right? That's something that we believe. Hey, if you're telling me the truth, look at me in my eyes and tell me, right? So try to capture the audience's attention at the beginning of the speech. You've got to decide you're going to tell a joke or whatever the case is. Please only do that if you're funny, right? If you're going to tell a joke or whatever the case is at the beginning of your presentation, those are things you need to consider. How am I going to get my audience's attention? I got to give them a reason to be able to listen to me. So your tone at the beginning sets the pace for whether or not, if you're fumbling and jumbling around at the beginning of the first 2 minutes, you probably turn people off. Establish your qualifications as a speaker. Now, if you're invited somewhere to speak, a lot of times people someone is going to introduce you, right, before you get to the stage to be able to speak. But there are things you could also do to establish your qualifications at the beginning and throughout the presentation. And that is a lot of times I was just talking about your experiences with what you're talking about. There's nothing like having experience, right? And so if you have an experience or many experiences with your topic at hand, then perhaps you're more believable because people know that you've actually been through whatever is going through. And then you always preview your thesis. What is your goal? You let your audience know your goal at the beginning of your speech, right? And you preview your speech, which is typically your main points. The body of your speech, that's your main points. Always preview your speech at the beginning. So today I will discuss, right? Or today you will hear me discuss. And my purpose is and so that way your audience has an idea of where you're going to be going with your presentation. That is really important at the beginning of any speech. All right, just a couple of things that you can use. You can have some rhetorical questions at the beginning of a speech. You can tell a story. You can present quotations, make some startling statement. You can ask your audience members questions. You could use humor, right? They're just some things that you can use, right? So you can ask rhetorical questions. You can tell a story. You can use personal quotes, right? You can use humor. You can make some kind of startling statement or something like that. Just some ways that you can start off your presentation. All right, so in closing now, always review. Because if you've been talking for a while, people might kind of forget some of what you were saying or a lot of what you were saying, depending on how the presentation was going. And so you want to go back and always review, right? So today I discussed so, and so. The highlights, which is kind of like your thesis, right? Hit on those highlights, those main points, review those main points, remind the audience of what you discussed, right? And then after that, that's when you'll have your closing statement. Give some sense of completion. Let people know that you're finished. Don't let them just see that you're packing up, and then they make the assumption, oh, well, I guess you're finished, right? So make sure that your audience knows that you're actually finished. Close, review your main points, have some kind of closing statement that you would then make. Now, in your closing statement, you could always refer to the opening statement that you had, right? So you could refer to your opening statement. Appeal for action. If it was a motivational speech, maybe you want everyone to go home now and write down their goals and post it on a wall if you're going to change your life or something like that, right? So there's an appeal for action, which means you want your audience to be able to do something, or you want to end with some type of challenge. I challenge you to go home tonight and to do whatever the case is, that sort of stuff. So have some kind of closing statement that calls for your audience to do something, to think about it, to ponder what was said today, whatever the situation is. Again, it depends on the type of speech you were giving and the event, the occasion, the context of the speech, right? Those are things that you would want to consider. Now, something that I really, really, really believe in and I want to stress is throughout your speech, make sure that you connect your ideas. Don't just talk straight and people don't know where you are. Make sure you have some headings to discuss, some headings that will guide you and it will guide your audience. And if you're lucky enough to be using PowerPoint or something like that and have access to a projector, then you'll want to include that stuff as well. So you want to use transitions, right? Now, in academic settings, sometimes I would suggest that students use some very simple transitions, such as, having just discussed XYZ, I will now discuss so, and so. So it lets the audience know that you just finished talking about this, and then you're now going to move on to this. So therefore, your audience can follow you, right? Your audience can follow you. They know where in your main points you are. They know exactly where you are in the body of that speech. They're not thinking, well, why is this person talking about this? And now they're talking about this. They're able to follow you throughout your presentation. So you always let your audience know, I just finished discussing this, and I will now discuss this. So having just discussed X, Y, and Z, I will now discuss A, B, and C. And so your audience can find, and always do that. Always find a way to do that so your audience can flow with you and you have really nice transitions. It makes it just easier for someone to follow your speech. So that's something to really help out with. It really does help with clarity, right? Those transitions really do help with clarity. It's just easy to follow and people could stay interested because they know what you're talking about, right? They understand what you're discussing. They know what you're talking about. All right, so those are just some things that I wanted to cover when it comes to, putting together a presentation. And so just keep in mind the key things. Always have your goal outlined. Know what is your goal of the speech. That is really, really important for you to have your goal. And after you have your goal, you can begin to build your speech from there. What are the main points that you want to discuss? How are you going to support those main points? You've got to find research, good research, right? Good, credible research, scholarly research, peer-reviewed research, not just always random blogs or websites that you run to be able to pull information to present to people, right? You want to be able to present credible, factual information when you're doing presentations. Remember the purpose of a transition, right? It allows your audience to be able to follow you throughout your presentation. And then keep in mind your intro. It's important. It sets the pace for your speech. What is your tone at the beginning, similar to the end of your speech? Is there a call of action that you have for your listeners, for the people in your audience? So thank you very much for taking the time to listen. And until next time, be good.